Hello everyone, Nathan Steuer here from Team Cosmos Heavy Play, and today I wanted to talk about an interesting scenario that happened in my finals match against Chris Larsen. We're playing a 73 card mirror, and we have a really controversial spot that came up where I wanted to show you my analysis and some of the thought process behind the scenes. Giving a little bit of context for this game, we start off and Chris Larsen, he's on the play, so he gets to go first, and we both have some relatively good hands at the start. I have a Llanowar Elves, and he starts off with a Chocobo. But going into turn 2, he has the ability of playing Bushwhack and fighting that, or he can play a Badgermole Cub, whatever he decides. Now, what's really interesting at the start of this is Chris doesn't know necessarily what my hand looks like, but he doesn't have a third land yet. So if he decides to cast the Bushwhack and fight my Llanowar Elves, he might not even have a third land to play with, and that kind of pushes me in favor of the line he chose, which is just develop your own mana and be on the play and go as quick as possible. Now I have some decisions to make. I could either make a play where I go Badgermole Cub, play Llanowar Elves, and develop my mana as much as possible, or alternatively, I can play Earthbender Ascension this turn and try to make it so that I start ramping right away. I end up going for the Badgermole Cub. The main difference here is I would have had to play the Bossing Say, which enters tapped, so less optionality here. But it's already looking a little bit rough for me because even though the development is going okay, I have one of my stronger starts, Chris is on the play and his hand looks pretty excellent. He has access to that Erode, which is one of the most important cards in the matchup. Will be really relevant later. He's already developed his Chocobo, which lets him attack in for some chunks of damage in the next few turns. Now with access to that Earthbender Ascension, this was sort of a critical moment looking back in retrospect, because if Chris had decided to play the Lumbering Worldwagon here instead of the Earthbender Ascension, he would have been able to both have an additional attacker next turn that gets him ramp and helps him hit his land drops, and it would have allowed a lot of his creatures that he draws to be a little bit easier to attack and set up with the Lumbering Worldwagon. So it's the first play that, looking back on it, I was a little bit surprised by. And one thing to note, Chris and I play tested together, right? So we have this rapport, and in terms of finals matches, this is a much more casual match than you usually see in the finals of such a high stakes event. We're both having a good time and we want to win, but we know that whatever the outcome is, we're going to be really happy for the other person. We're helping each other with counters so we don't miss triggers. We're trying to make sure that this game is played in a way that feels good for both of us. And spoiler, maybe I'm foreshadowing a bit, but doesn't go exactly as planned in this one. These turns are very essential. We're both trying to put together a game plan, and Chris is out in front of me, doing really well with a lot of his interaction. Nonetheless, I can make an Earthbender Ascension, start hitting my lands and eventually putting counters, play an Icetill Explorer. I'm developing and kind of just in the waiting room hoping to find something that lets me get through for a large punch. Whether that effect is me being able to find an answer to what he's doing, like an Erode to stop a big creature, or a Mightform Harmonizer to start potentially hitting for a ton of damage, remains to be seen. Here we are. We're going into this turn, and Chris is going to do exactly what he wants to do by putting that Lumbering Worldwagon in play, and he picked up the Mightform Harmonizer, which means I'm in some trouble going into this game. I can set up some blocks, or I can take the hit off the Chocobo, but regardless, he just killed the copy of Icetill Explorer in play, so even if I do draw that copy of Harmonizer, I'm not going to be able to kill him. Regardless, though, the Erode in his hand is a pretty big deal. So here I don't have too much going on. I can start putting counters on things. I can use Bossing Say. I can play Keen-Eyed Curator. But with Chris's hand, it's looking like a bit of a disastrous scenario for me. He has a big draw step. That Deodrine is crucial because it means he gets an additional landfall trigger potentially if he removes that counter from the forest. We talked about this interaction before, but if you pick up a counter off an Earthbended land, then it'll go to the graveyard and then return to play because it no longer has any power and toughness. So that's one of the cute interactions that our deck was built with in mind, and helps him set up potentially a really sneaky lethal in the face of my 2 blockers, or 3 blockers rather. So he's going to combat, and I have 1 card in hand. We both know at this point that if I don't have a way of killing his attacker, it's going to be a lethal attack, because if you look at what's going on in the game, this Lumbering Worldwagon is going to be a 6 power doubled to a 12 power, and then he can erode his own creature, and from there, it's at least 52 points, probably more. So a ton of damage that he's representing. You see me at this stage. This is something I didn't even notice until I looked back. I'm thinking before I let him attack, do I want to cast Erode on his World Wagon? If I don't cast Erode on the World Wagon, potentially it's a disaster for me because he gets that landfall trigger and his Earthbender Ascension is creeping very close. So I'm thinking about it and decide I have to let him attack. I can't do too much about it at the moment, but I know that my Keen-Eyed Curator can eat one of his lands, and that's one of the key interactions that Chris actually misses at this point in the game, because he hadn't seen it come up in any of our playtesting. And you see here, what Chris does is he uses the World Wagon, he puts a land into play, then he goes to Deodrine and remove that forest and put it into play. And this is where things become a little bit unclear for both of us, because from my perspective, I'm thinking, I need that Keen-Eyed Curator to make sure that forest never hits the battlefield. And from his perspective, he's thinking that forest is always hitting the battlefield, no questions asked. I start getting a little bit worried, and he's, moving around his thing, trying to undo it. I'm like, no, like, you've already removed the counter. You can't take this back. I can exile it. I can tap my land so that you don't do that right now. So I'm a little bit like, what is going on here? Just tap the land in front of me. Chris didn't understand what was going on. I'm still trying to explain to him, no, the land is exiled, like that's how it works. And he's like, oh, shoot. But the land shouldn't be in play. So we're both, having this back and forth in the middle of him still having not resolved the Deodrine. He hasn't drawn his card off the Deodrine. It's a little bit of a mess. At this point, I realize, oh wait, I tapped the wrong land for my card because I was so concerned about him not keeping that land in play. If that land hits the battlefield, it's a disaster for me because his Earthbender Ascension goes to 4, his Lumbering World Wagon gets doubled again, and it goes from being, a 14 power creature to a 30 power creature with trample. The game instantly ends no matter what, unless I want to kill it. In my mind, I'm like, oh, that's not right, and tapped the first land in front of me. At the same time, when I'm looking back at the scenario, like in the moment, I decide, wait, I tapped the wrong land, actually. I'd like to make a different way of tapping this land so that I can hold up the removal spell in my hand. Part of the rules and how they work these days is if no information is changed in the game, there's no real advantage I could have gained from this. Therefore, you can undo how you tap your mana. And that was exactly what I asked Chris about. I said, hey, can I undo how I tap? Otherwise, I'd like to talk to a judge. He's like, sure. A little bit confused about what happened because he didn't realize that I was going to exile his land. And this is where the game becomes really wacky. Because we're both in this staring contest. He sees that I'm untapping my white source, and now he has to consider the possibility that I have Erode. If my white source is tapped, he knows the game is over. He can erode his own forest, get 2 lands into play, 1 off the forest returning and 1 from his deck, and then that World Wagon is dealing me approximately 100 damage or so. It's way more than my life, and there's nothing I can do about it, really. Even if I can Keen-Eyed Curator eat one of them, he only needs the 1 landfall trigger off the Erode in order to win. That's where things become really, really wacky in this game, where I go to blocks in a second here and decide, sure, I go for the block here and the fetch in order to put another counter on the Keen-Eyed Curator and try to trade off our creatures potentially. And here, this is where Chris, if he casts a Erode and it resolves and I have nothing, he wins the game. But if I have Erode, then I can suddenly kill his Lumbering World Wagon and potentially have a draw step to hit Mightform Harmonizer and kill him out of nowhere in this game. And he ends up going for it. He casts Erode, I have the Erode, I miraculously top deck the Mightform Harmonizer for very close to not being lethal, but just enough to kill him alongside that Bossing Say. In reflection, I end up taking down this game kind of on the ropes. If he had left up that Erode, there's no way I could have snuck past what he had going on. It was one of those games where, from both our perspectives, he thought, there's no way I could possibly mistap my land and have the Erode in that situation. And he thought very highly of me. We were teammates and friends. We talked about the game afterward. Obviously, there's no hard feelings or anything. But from my perspective, I was just so focused on making sure that Keen-Eyed Curator made sure his land didn't return that I tapped the first land in front of me and then realized, oh wait, that's not the right land to tap as he's trying to return his land into play and tutor a land with World Wagon. And so that was like a game deciding moment where he cast that Erode and went for it, thinking I couldn't have the removal spell. So those were two scenarios. In this, one, it felt, in reflection, a really strange game that felt like I was losing the whole time, and just this really, really small thing that we were both thinking about ended up being the decider with the Erode at the end there.